My son-in-law just called me an ignorant peasant in French at his gallery opening. I'm Thomas Edwards, and Lucas thought I couldn't understand when he told his art world friends that my gift was worthless garbage from a tone-deaf old man. But the sheet music in my hands wasn't garbage. It was an unpublished Debussy manuscript worth $890,000. And Lucas had no idea that his mockery had just triggered something he wasn't prepared for. See, Lucas assumed three things about me tonight. First, that I don't speak French. Second, that I know nothing about classical music. And third, that I'm just some blue-collar nobody who stumbled into his sophisticated world. He was wrong about all three. Devastatingly wrong. What happened next didn't just expose his arrogance, it shattered everything he thought he knew about his family's most painful tragedy. Let me back up to explain how I ended up in this situation. 3 years ago, when Lucas married my daughter Elizabeth, I made a decision that probably saved our family. I decided to hide who I really was. See, Lucas had just lost his younger sister Emma in a car accident. She was 19, a music student at Manhattan School of Music, and her death had destroyed him. He couldn't listen to classical music anymore, couldn't be around anything that reminded him of her talent, her dreams, her future that would never happen. So when Elizabeth brought home this broken young man who was trying to rebuild his life in the art world as far away from music as possible, I made a choice. I didn't tell him I was Professor Thomas Edwards, recently retired from Juilliard after 35 years. I didn't mention my specialty in French Impressionist composers. I didn't talk about my consulting work with auction houses or my collection of rare manuscripts. Instead, I became Tom the piano tuner, which wasn't technically a lie. I did tune pianos as a hobby, staying connected to the instruments I'd spent my life studying. But it wasn't the whole truth either. Lucas needed a father-in-law who wouldn't remind him of his sister's world. So that's what I gave him. For 3 years, I've watched him slowly build his gallery business, find confidence in contemporary art, create a new identity that didn't include the crushing weight of musical genius lost too soon. But I've also watched him become someone else, someone harder, more dismissive of people he considers beneath his cultural level. Tonight's gallery opening at Meridian Contemporary in Soho was supposed to be different. Elizabeth had begged me to come, said Lucas was finally ready to bridge the gap between us. She'd even suggested I bring him something meaningful, a peace offering, to show I understood his world. That's when I remembered the manuscript. I'd acquired it 5 years ago through an estate sale in Connecticut. The elderly owner, Mrs. Chen, was selling her late husband's collection of classical memorabilia. Most of it was standard stuff, signed programs, vintage recordings, reproduction scores. But buried in a box of miscellaneous papers was something extraordinary, an unpublished Debussy composition. Daydream for Emma, dated 1894. The authentication process took 2 years and cost me $12,000. Bibliothèque Nationale de France confirmed the paper in ink. Sotheby's provided the $890,000 valuation. The WC Foundation verified the composer's handwriting against known exemplars. I'd planned to donate it to a museum, but when Elizabeth asked me to bring Lucas something special, something that might help us connect, I thought maybe this was the moment. Maybe it was time to start bridging the gap between Tom the piano tuner and Professor Edwards. I should have known better. The Meridian Contemporary Gallery was packed with Manhattan's art elite. Polished concrete floors reflected track lighting that cost more than most people's cars. I stood near the back in my simple navy cardigan and worn leather shoes, watching sophisticated people discuss market values and investment opportunities rather than the artwork itself. My wife, Catherine, would have known exactly what to say to these people. She always had a way of moving effortlessly between worlds. Academic conferences in the morning community center, volunteer work in the afternoon. Her passing 5 years ago left a void I've never quite figured out how to fill. Instead, I've filled my apartment with rare manuscripts and first editions, creating a cocoon of music history that keeps me company during lonely evenings. Lucas approached with his usual professional confidence, tailored charcoal suit, perfectly fitted, surrounded by potential clients. Behind him were two serious collectors I recognized from Art News magazine, people whose opinions could make or break careers in the contemporary art world. Tom. Lucas's greeting was warm enough, but I could see the slight tension around his eyes. Having his blue-collar father-in-law at his professional event wasn't ideal. Sarah said you had something for me. I handed him the protective sleeve containing the manuscript. Through the clear plastic-aged cream paper showed handwritten musical notation in brown ink. Lucas accepted it with the polite enthusiasm of someone receiving an obligation gift. Sheet music. That's thoughtful. And that's when everything went wrong. Lucas held the manuscript up to examine it, and I could see his expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed amusement. The small crowd around us, gallery assistants, art bloggers, potential buyers, sensed something happening and moved closer. Interesting, Lucas said, his voice carrying just enough volume to include his audience. Where did you find this Tom estate sale in Connecticut? I replied honestly. Lucas nodded knowingly, sharing a look with his companions. Ah, estate sales. You have to be careful with those. Lots of reproductions floating around. The way he said reproductions made it clear what he thought of my purchase. One of the collectors, a woman in an expensive black dress, leaned closer. What kind of music is it? Appears to be classical, Lucas said, tilting the manuscript toward her. Probably printed from a website. You can get anything online these days. If I stayed silent now, several things would happen, and none of them good. First, my relationship with Lucas would calcify permanently. He'd always see me as the well-meaning but naive father-in-law who embarrassed him at professional events. Our family dinners would become even more strained, filled with his patient condescension. Second, Elizabeth would blame herself. She'd orchestrated this evening specifically to bring Lucas and me together. She'd spent weeks convincing me to attend, promising it would be a chance for us to find common ground. Watching her gift-giving moment turn into a source of shame would crush her. Third, Lucas would never understand what he'd actually received, never grasp the significance of the music in his hands, or how it connected to the sister he'd lost. But the worst part was watching the crowd's reaction. These weren't cruel people. They were just following Lucas's lead, taking their cues from someone they respected in the art world. If Lucas had treated my gift with curiosity instead of dismissal, they would have been intrigued. Instead, they were learning it was safe to look down on the old man with the fake manuscript. I might have let it go if Lucas had stopped there, but he didn't. He switched to French, assuming I wouldn't understand, and said to the woman beside him, "C'est vraiment pathétique. Un vieil homme ignorant qui pense avoir trouvé un trésor. Je ne sais pas comment lui dire que c'est sans valeur." It's truly pathetic. An ignorant old man who thinks he's found a treasure. I don't know how to tell him it's worthless. The woman laughed politely, but her eyes held a hint of discomfort. Lucas continued, emboldened. Mon beau-père est un homme simple. Un accordeur de piano qui ne comprend rien à l'art ou à la musique de qualité. My father-in-law is a simple man, a piano tuner who understands nothing about art or quality music. I felt my cheeks grow warm, not with embarrassment, but with the slow-burning anger I hadn't experienced in years. Not for myself, I'd long ago abandoned any need for validation from people like Lucas, but for what his words represented. The casual cruelty of dismissing someone's knowledge and experience based on appearances. The arrogance of assuming superiority without investigation. In that moment, I thought about the day Catherine and I had found out about our scholarship fund's first recipient. We'd established the Thomas and Catherine Edwards Piano Performance Grant at Juilliard 15 years ago, using a portion of our retirement savings to help promising students who might otherwise struggle with the crushing costs of elite music education. The first student who received our grant went on to perform with the New York Philharmonic. Catherine had cried when we attended her debut. After Catherine passed, I'd established another scholarship in her memory, this one at Manhattan School of Music, where Emma had studied. The Catherine Edwards Memorial Scholarship provided $25,000 annually to a piano student who showed extraordinary promise. I'd never told Elizabeth or Lucas about it. Somehow it felt too personal to share a private tribute to my wife's belief that music could heal even the deepest wounds. Perhaps that was why Emma's death had affected me so deeply, even though I'd never met her. When Elizabeth described her future sister-in-law's talent and passion, I recognized the same fire that burned in my most dedicated students. When she told me about the accident, a rainy night, a taxi running a red light, a life of potential extinguished in seconds, I mourned not just for Lucas's loss, but for the music that would never be created. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until weeks after Elizabeth and Lucas's wedding, was that Emma had known who I was. She'd applied for my master class at Juilliard the summer before her death. Her application essay spoke eloquently about her admiration for my work on Debussy's Preludes and her desire to study French Impressionist piano techniques. I'd selected her application for further consideration, but she died before interviews were scheduled. Catherine had known. In the final months of her illness, while I was distracted by doctor appointments and medication schedules, she had contacted Emma directly. My wife, always wiser than me about human connections, had recognized something special in Emma's application and reached out to encourage her. They'd exchanged several emails, forming a brief but meaningful mentorship that ended only with Catherine's death. I discovered these emails while going through Catherine's computer after the funeral. Reading them had been like hearing her voice again, her encouragement of young talent, her gentle guidance, her unwavering belief that music could bridge any divide. In her final email to Emma, she'd written, "When you meet my husband someday, play Debussy's Reverie for him. It's his favorite piece to teach, and he'll understand immediately what I see in you." Emma never got that chance, and Lucas never knew that his sister had been connected to me before we ever met. When Elizabeth introduced us after Emma's death, I recognized the name immediately, but kept silent. What good would it have done to tell this grieving brother that his sister had almost been my student, that my wife had seen her potential? It would have only deepened his pain, reinforced his association of music with loss. So I became Tom the piano tuner. I put away my academic regalia, simplified my vocabulary, and played the role of a blue-collar craftsman who knew instruments but not the music played on them. For 3 years, I'd maintained this fiction, watching Lucas rebuild his life while keeping my distance from the world of classical music that might trigger his grief. And now, standing in his gallery with his French mockery ringing in my ears, I had to decide. Continue the charade, protecting his fragile peace at the cost of my dignity, or reveal the truth and risk reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. Lucas was still speaking in French, becoming more animated as his audience grew. "Ce document n'est même pas une bonne contrefaçon. Regardez les notes, elles sont mal formées. Debussy n'aurait jamais écrit comme ça." This document isn't even a good forgery. Look at the notes, they're poorly formed. Debussy would never have written like that. That was when I noticed an older woman at the edge of our group, perhaps in her late 70s, watching the exchange with increasing distress. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. Something about her seemed familiar, but I couldn't place her. Lucas continued his critique, pointing to specific sections of the manuscript, et ce titre, Daydream for Emma, c'est ridicule. Debussy n'aurait jamais utilisé un titre anglais, et certainement pas avec une dédicace aussi sentimentale. And this title, Daydream for Emma, it's ridiculous. Debussy would never have used an English title, and certainly not with such a sentimental dedication. The older woman took a step forward but hesitated. I caught her eye, and in that moment of connection, I realized who she was. Diane Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law, the woman who had helped me acquire the manuscript 5 years ago. That was the final push I needed, not for my sake, but for hers, for the family history embedded in that manuscript that Lucas was casually dismissing, for Emma, who would never play Debussy for me as Catherine had wished, and for Elizabeth, who deserved to know the truth about her father. I cleared my throat and responded in French. My accent, honed through decades of academic exchanges with the Conservatoire de Paris, was flawless. Vous faites plusieurs erreurs dans votre évaluation, Lucas. Premièrement, Debussy a effectivement écrit des titres en anglais, notamment The Little Nigger en 1909. Deuxièmement, cette dédicace n'est pas sentimentale, mais historique. Emma Bardak était le nom de la femme qui est devenue sa seconde épouse. Et troisièmement, ces notes que vous considérez comme mal formées sont en fait caractéristiques de l'écriture de Debussy lors de sa période de transition en 1840. You're making several errors in your assessment, Lucas. First, Debussy did indeed write titles in English, notably The Little Nigger in 1909. Second, this dedication isn't sentimental, but historical. Emma Bardak was the name of the woman who became his second wife. And third, these notes that you consider poorly formed are actually characteristic of Debussy's handwriting during his transition period in 1894. The silence that fell over our little group was absolute. Lucas stared at me, his face draining of color, his mouth slightly open. The collector in the black dress stepped back, her eyebrows raised in surprise. The gallery assistant beside Lucas looked confused, glancing between us as though trying to understand what had just happened. I continued in French, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. Ce manuscrit a été authentifié par la Bibliothèque nationale de France, évalué par Sotheby's à 891 000 et vérifié par la Fondation Bercy comme étant incontestablement de la main de Claude Debussy. Ce n'est pas une reproduction d'Internet Lucas. C'est un trésor musical perdu depuis longtemps qui a une connexion particulière avec votre famille. This manuscript has been authenticated by the National Library of France, valued by Sotheby's at $890,000, and verified by the WC Foundation as undoubtedly in Claude Debussy's hand. It's not an internet reproduction, Lucas. It's a long-lost musical treasure that has a particular connection to your family. I switched to English, ensuring everyone present could understand. You see, Lucas, I'm not actually just a piano tuner. I'm Professor Thomas Edwards, former chair of piano studies at Juilliard and specialist in French Impressionist composers. I've spent the last 3 years pretending to be someone else because I didn't want to remind you of the world your sister lived in. I didn't want to cause you more pain by being a constant reminder of what you'd lost. Lucas took a step backward, bumping into a pedestal displaying a small sculpture. The gallery assistant steadied it quickly, but Lucas didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on me, his expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and the beginning edges of understanding. The manuscript you're holding isn't just valuable because it's a previously unknown Debussy piece. It's valuable because of its connection to Emma. You see, the piece is titled Daydream for Emma. And while Debussy did write it for Emma Bardak in 1894, its discovery now in your hands feels like more than coincidence. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, then her voice soft but clear. Butter Edwards is right. When my husband acquired this manuscript in Paris in 1964, he always said it was waiting for the right Emma to play it. We kept it safe for decades, waiting for that connection to reveal itself. Lucas looked at Mrs. Chen, then back to me, his professional composure utterly shattered. The polished gallery owner was gone, replaced by the grieving brother I'd first met 3 years ago. How do you know about Emma? His voice was barely above a whisper. That was the question I'd been dreading. How could I tell him that his sister had applied to study with me, that my wife had corresponded with her, that in another world, one without rainy nights and careless taxi drivers, Emma might have become my student, might have played Debussy in my living room while Catherine served tea. But before I could answer, Elizabeth appeared at Lucas's side, her face concerned. She must have noticed the tension from across the gallery. Dad, what's happening? I looked at my daughter, so much like her mother, perceptive and kind, and realized I couldn't maintain the fiction any longer. Not for Lucas's sake, not for Elizabeth's, not for my own. I think it's time I told you both who I really am, and who Emma was about to become. The truth about Emma's connection to me would have been difficult enough to explain in private. Revealing it in the middle of Lucas's gallery opening, surrounded by the art world elite, whose approval he desperately sought, was something else entirely. But we were beyond the point of careful timing and controlled narratives. The moment demanded honesty, however uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on Lucas's arm. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Lucas shook his head, his eyes never leaving my face. His voice, when he found it, carried the ragged edge of barely controlled emotion. No, I want to hear this right here. Elizabeth's confusion was palpable as she looked between us. Dad, what is Lucas talking about? What do you mean who you really are? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say would permanently alter our family dynamic. Your father, Elizabeth said, his voice strangely distant, is apparently Professor Thomas Edwards of Juilliard. Not Tom the piano tuner. Elizabeth's eyes widened. Dad, is that true? I nodded slowly. I retired from Juilliard 5 years ago after 35 years teaching piano performance and music theory. I specialized in French Impressionist composers, particularly Debussy and Ravel. But why would you hide that Elizabeth's hurt was evident in her voice? Why would you pretend to be someone else for 3 years? Lucas answered before I could. Because of Emma. Because he knew I couldn't bear anything that reminded me of her world. He was still holding the manuscript. I noticed his fingers now gripping it too tightly. I gestured toward it, concerned. That's quite valuable, Lucas. Perhaps we should put it somewhere safe while we talk. He looked down at the manuscript as though seeing it for the first time, then carefully placed it back in its protective sleeve. Tell me about Emma. His voice was steel wrapped in silk, controlled but with an unmistakable edge. I glanced around the gallery. The initial crowd of onlookers had dispersed somewhat, giving us a small bubble of privacy, but we were still very much in public. Not ideal conditions for such a delicate conversation. But Lucas's stance made it clear he wasn't moving until he got answers. 3 months before Emma died, she applied to attend my summer masterclass at Juilliard. Her application was exceptional. She submitted a recording of Debussy's Clair de Lune that showed remarkable sensitivity and technical skill. I selected her application for the interview round, but she died before that happened. Lucas finished his voice flat. Yes, I never met her in person, but I knew her name, her talent. So when Elizabeth introduced us after the wedding, I recognized who you were immediately. I made the decision then not to tell you about the almost connection. You were still deep in grief, and I thought knowing she'd almost been my student would only make things worse. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. You knew about Emma all this time and never said anything. I had to make a choice, Elizabeth. Tell the truth and risk causing more pain, or create a fiction that would allow Lucas to heal. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat softly. If I may, sometimes the most valuable gifts come to us through unexpected channels. My husband believed this manuscript had a purpose beyond its historical significance. When Dr. Edwards purchased it from our estate sale, I felt it had found the right custodian. Lucas looked at the elderly woman with new attention. How did your husband acquire it? Mrs. Chen's expression grew solemn. My husband's family fled Paris in 1940, just ahead of the German occupation. They were Jewish art dealers who managed to escape with a few precious items, including this manuscript, which had been entrusted to them for authentication by a French musician. They made it to Shanghai, where my husband was born, in a refugee ghetto. The manuscript stayed hidden in a false-bottom suitcase for decades. It was one of the few connections they had to their life before. The gravity of this history settled over our small group. The manuscript wasn't just a valuable musical document or a coincidental connection to Emma. It was a survival artifact, a piece of history that had endured tremendous darkness. For the first time since our confrontation began, Lucas's expression softened slightly. I didn't know. Few people do, Mrs. Chen replied. My husband was a very private man, but he always said this piece would find its way to the right hands eventually. He called it music in exile, waiting to come home. I hadn't known this part of the manuscript's history myself. When I purchased it from the estate sale, Mrs. Chen had mentioned only that it had been in her husband's collection for many years. This new dimension added layers of meaning to what I'd originally seen as simply a remarkable musical discovery. But there was more to reveal, and I couldn't postpone it any longer. There's something else you should know, Lucas. After my wife Catherine died, I was going through her correspondence and discovered she had been in contact with Emma. Lucas physically recoiled as though I'd struck him. What Catherine was helping me review applications for the masterclass while she was ill. She was particularly impressed with Emma's submission and took the initiative to email her directly. They exchanged several messages in the months before we lost them both. Elizabeth pressed a hand to her mouth, tears now flowing freely. Mom knew Emma, and you never told me. I couldn't find the right way to tell you, I admitted. At first, I was lost in my own grief for Catherine. Then when I met Lucas and realized who Emma was, it seemed cruel to reveal this connection that could never be fully explored. What did they talk about? Lucas's question was barely audible. Music, mostly. Catherine encouraged Emma's interest in Debussy. In her last email, she suggested that Emma should play Reverie for me someday. She told Emma I would understand immediately what Catherine saw in her talent. Lucas's composure finally broke. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment I feared he might collapse. Elizabeth moved quickly to his side, supporting him, her own shock temporarily set aside to tend to her husband's pain. I found myself wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe the fiction should have continued. Maybe Lucas wasn't ready to face these connections, these alternate timelines where his sister might have become my student, might have fulfilled the promise my wife had seen in her. But then Lucas looked up, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger or accusation, but a desperate hunger for connection. Do you have them, the emails? His voice cracked on the question. Yes, I've kept every one. And recordings. Did she send recordings? To Catherine, several. Practice sessions mostly, working through difficult passages of Debussy and Ravel. Lucas closed his eyes briefly, and I could see him struggling for control. When he opened them again, determination had replaced desperation. I want to hear them. All of them. I want to read what she wrote to your wife. His voice faltered. I want to know that part of her that I tried to erase. The words hung in the air between us, a confession I hadn't expected. Lucas had deliberately cut himself off from Emma's musical world after her death, refusing to engage with the art form that had defined her short life. In doing so, he'd walled off essential parts of who she was, who she had been becoming. I think Emma would want that too, I said softly. And there's one more thing you should know. After Catherine died, I established a scholarship in her memory at Manhattan School of Music, where Emma studied. It provides $25,000 annually to a promising piano student facing financial challenges. I never told you because I didn't want to intrude on your grief. But the truth is I've been connected to Emma's world all along, trying in my own way to honor what she might have become. Mrs. Chen, who had been listening quietly, spoke again. My husband would be pleased to know his manuscript found its way to Emma's brother. Perhaps music finds the paths we ourselves cannot see. One of the art collectors who had witnessed the initial confrontation stepped forward, addressing Lucas. Your gallery opening has taken an unexpected turn, Mr. Bennett, but I find myself more interested in your work now than I was an hour ago. There's something powerful about understanding the connections between different art forms, music and visual art past and present. Perhaps there's a curatorial direction here worth exploring. Lucas blinked momentarily, pulled back to his professional role. I've never considered connecting my gallery work to classical music. The collector smiled. The most compelling art often emerges from unexpected intersections. Your personal connection to both worlds could offer something unique in the contemporary market. I watched as Lucas processed this suggestion, seeing the moment when professional opportunity aligned with personal healing. For 3 years, he'd been running from Emma's world. Maybe now he could find a way to incorporate it into his new identity to bridge the gap between who she was and who he had become. Elizabeth, who had been quietly supporting her husband, finally spoke. Dad, I wish you had told us the truth from the beginning, but I understand why you didn't. She turned to Lucas. And I understand why you needed to distance yourself from music after Emma died. But maybe it's time for both of you to stop protecting each other from the past. Her wisdom, so like her mother's, cut through the tension that had built between us. She was right, of course. Lucas and I had both been engaged in a delicate dance of avoidance, each trying to shield the other from painful truths, each sacrificing authenticity for the sake of fragile peace. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly at Elizabeth's words. Sometimes the most difficult paths lead to the most necessary destinations. Lucas looked down at the manuscript in its protective sleeve, then back at me. You said this piece is called Daydream for Emma. Yes, Debussy wrote it for Emma Bardak in 1894 before she became his wife. It's a simpler composition than his later works, more direct in its emotional appeal, less technically complex. But there's a purity to it that's quite moving. And you think, Lucas hesitated. You think Emma would have played this? I believe she would have loved it, I said honestly. Based on the recordings she sent Catherine, this piece would have suited her interpretive style perfectly. She had a remarkable touch for bringing out the luminous quality in Debussy's melodic lines. Lucas took a deep breath. I'd like to hear it, someday, when I'm ready. It wasn't forgiveness or full reconciliation, that would take time. But it was an opening and acknowledgement that the wall he'd built between himself and Emma's musical legacy might someday come down. I nodded, understanding the enormity of what he was offering. When you're ready, I'll be here. The gallery assistant, who had been hovering nervously nearby, finally approached Lucas. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett, but the critics from Art Forum have arrived. They're asking to speak with you about the Nakamura installation. Lucas straightened his shoulders visibly, pulling himself back into his professional persona. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. He turned to me. We're not finished with this conversation, Professor Edwards. I found myself smiling slightly at the formal address. No, I don't believe we are. As Lucas moved away to attend to his professional obligations, Elizabeth stepped closer, her expression a complex mixture of hurt and understanding. Why, Dad? Why didn't you trust me with the truth? It wasn't about trust, Elizabeth. It was about protecting a family that was just beginning to form. You loved Lucas. He needed to heal. I didn't want to be the constant reminder of what he'd lost. Elizabeth shook her head. You've spent 3 years pretending to be someone you're not. That must have been lonely. Her perception struck me to the core. It had been lonely in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. Hiding my life's work, my passion for music, my academic achievements, it had created a distance not just between Lucas and me, but between Elizabeth and me as well. I've missed you, Dad. The real you. The one who used to explain Debussy's harmonies to me when I was little. The one who took me to faculty concerts at Juilliard and taught me to listen for the conversation between instruments. I felt a tightness in my chest at her words. I've missed that too, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching our exchange with sympathetic eyes, spoke again. Perhaps this manuscript was meant to bring truth to the surface to Edwards. Some music cannot stay silent forever. I turned to her, struck by the wisdom in her observation. Thank you for being here tonight, Mrs. Chen. Your presence made a difference. She inclined her head slightly. My husband believed deeply in what he called the responsibility of custodianship. Those who protect cultural treasures must also ensure they fulfill their purpose in the world. You've been a good custodian, Dr. Edwards. Now it's time for this music to live again. As she moved away to examine one of the gallery's installations, I was left with Elizabeth. Both of us processing the seismic shift that had just occurred in our family dynamics. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we give Lucas space to absorb what he's learned, and time to decide how much of Emma's world he's ready to reclaim. Elizabeth's gaze drifted to where Lucas was speaking with the art critics, his professional mask firmly back in place. Do you think he'll ever be able to listen to her music again? I think he already took the first step tonight, I replied. By accepting the manuscript, by acknowledging its connection to Emma, he's opened a door he's kept firmly shut for 3 years. Elizabeth nodded slowly. He keeps a box of her things in our closet, sheet music, concert programs, recordings. He's never opened it since we got married, but he couldn't bear to throw it away either. That tells me he's been waiting for the right moment to reconnect with that part of her, I said. Perhaps tonight is the catalyst he needed. As we stood together in the gallery watching Lucas navigate his professional responsibilities, while carrying the weight of newly revealed connections to his sister's life, I felt a presence beside me that I hadn't experienced in years. Catherine would have handled this differently, I thought, more gracefully, more compassionately, but she would have approved of the truth finally emerging. For 3 years, I'd hidden my identity to protect Lucas from painful associations. But in doing so, I denied him the possibility of healing through those very connections. Catherine would have seen that from the beginning. She always understood that the path through grief wasn't around the pain, but directly through it. Elizabeth squeezed my hand. Mom would be proud of you, Dad, for finding a way to honor Emma and for finally telling the truth. In that moment, surrounded by contemporary art, in a world far removed from the concert halls and practice rooms that had defined my career, I felt the weight of pretense lifting from my shoulders. Professor Thomas Edwards was stepping back into the light after 3 years in the shadows. And somehow I knew that both Catherine and Emma were applauding from wherever they were. The manuscript that had triggered tonight's revelations, Daydream for Emma, had traveled an extraordinary path. From Debussy's desk in 1894 to a Jewish family fleeing Nazi occupation, from a refugee's suitcase in Shanghai to an estate sale in Connecticut, and finally to this gallery in Soho, where it had connected a grieving brother to the sister he'd tried to forget. Music in exile, Mrs. Chen's husband had called it, finally finding its way home. I looked directly into Lucas's eyes and responded in flawless French, my accent honed through decades at the Sorbonne and Conservatoire de Paris. My words flowed with the precise cadence of an academic lecture. Monsieur, permettez-moi de corriger vos erreurs concernant ce manuscrit. Votre évaluation révèle malheureusement des lacunes considérables dans votre connaissance de Debussy et de son œuvre. The gallery fell silent. The ambient conversation vanished as if someone had pressed a universal mute button. All eyes turned toward our little tableau, the old man in worn shoes suddenly speaking impeccable French, the sophisticated gallery owner frozen in mid-gesture. In the crystalline moment between my first sentence and Lucas's comprehension, I watched his face transform. His expression shifted from smug certainty to confusion, then dawning horror as he realized I'd understood every dismissive word. Lucas's complexion drained to the color of gallery walls. The wine glass in his left hand trembled slightly, red liquid catching the track lighting as it sloshed dangerously close to the rim. Behind him, the collector in the black dress took an instinctive step backward, her eyebrows arching in surprise. The gallery assistant glanced between us, confusion evident in her pinched expression. I continued in French, my voice carrying clearly through the silence. Ces manuscrits a été authentifié par trois institutions indépendantes. La datation du papier et de l'encre confirme son origine à la fin du XIXe siècle. L'analyse graphologique correspond parfaitement aux autres manuscrits connus de Debussy de cette période. Switching to English, I addressed the growing audience directly. This manuscript is not a reproduction or forgery. It's an original Debussy composition dated 1894, authenticated by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Sotheby's has valued it at $890,000. The WC Foundation has verified the composer's handwriting against known exemplars. Lucas swallowed hard, his professional poise evaporating under the collective gaze of Manhattan's art elite. The same people whose approval he'd been courting all evening were now witnessing his humiliation. Professor Edwards. The question barely made it past his lips, more breath than sound. The meticulously curated image he'd presented, sophisticated gallery owner with an intuitive understanding of value and authenticity, was crumbling before their eyes. His perceived expertise, the foundation of his professional identity, had been publicly undermined, and by whom the father-in-law he'd dismissed as a simple piano tuner. Yes, Lucas. Professor Thomas Edwards, former chair of piano studies at Juilliard, specialist in French Impressionist composers, with a particular focus on Debussy's unpublished works. My voice remained calm, neither triumphant nor accusatory. This wasn't about victory, but truth, a distinction that seemed increasingly important as I watched Lucas struggle to process what was happening. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her elegant black dress and simple pearl necklace, lending her an air of quiet authority. The manuscript has a remarkable provenance, Mr. Bennett. My husband's family preserved it through extraordinary circumstances. The German occupation of Paris, their escape to Shanghai, decades in exile. Der Edwards is its first owner since my husband acquired it in 1964. The collector who'd been examining the manuscript with Lucas earlier interjected. I believe I've read your monograph on Debussy's harmonic innovations, Professor Edwards. Your analysis of his transitional period was groundbreaking. Lucas's gaze darted between us, his world reconfiguring itself in real time. The precision-engineered social hierarchy he'd established for tonight's event, with himself at the apex and his father-in-law firmly at the bottom, had been instantaneously inverted. His voice, when he finally found it, carried the stunned quality of someone regaining consciousness after an unexpected blow. Why didn't you tell me? Before I could answer, Elizabeth appeared at his side, her face a study in confusion. Dad, what's happening? Her question encompassed far more than the immediate scene. The silent gallery, the manuscript, the tension crackling between her father and husband. Lucas turned to her, his voice unnaturally tight. Your father has been lying to us for 3 years. He's not a piano tuner. He's Professor Thomas Edwards of Juilliard. Elizabeth's eyes widened, her gaze shifting to me with stunned disbelief. Dad, is that true? The hurt in her voice pierced me more deeply than Lucas's humiliation. While I'd been protecting him from painful associations with music, I'd been deceiving my own daughter, the person who should have been able to trust me implicitly. The collateral damage of my well-intentioned deception suddenly seemed indefensible. Yes, sweetheart, I retired from Juilliard 5 years ago after Catherine died. When I met Lucas and learned about Emma, I thought it would be easier for everyone if I simplified my background. Easier. Elizabeth's voice rose slightly. You've been pretending to be someone else since my wedding. How is that easier? Lucas was still holding the manuscript, his knuckles white against the protective sleeve. Emma knew who you were, didn't she? The question cut through the gallery like a blade, redirecting everyone's attention. That's what this is really about. My sister. The confrontation had shifted from professional embarrassment to something far more personal. Lucas wasn't just facing a father-in-law who'd concealed his identity. He was confronting a direct connection to the sister whose memory he'd walled off from his new life. The silence around us deepened as gallery patrons recognized the unfolding human drama exceeded any artwork on display. 3 months before Emma died, she applied to attend my summer master class at Juilliard. My admission landed softly in the hushed space. Her application was exceptional. Her interpretation of Debussy showed remarkable sensitivity. I selected her for an interview, but the accident happened first. Lucas completed my sentence, his voice hollow. And you knew this when you met me at the wedding. Yes, I recognized your name immediately. I chose not to mention it because you were still deep in grief. I thought knowing Emma had almost been my student would only cause more pain. Lucas set the manuscript down carefully on a nearby pedestal, his movements deliberate as though handling explosives. You had no right to make that decision for me, to withhold that connection to my sister. Mrs. Chen's gentle voice interrupted the building tension. Sometimes protection becomes its own form of harm, Mr. Bennett. My husband kept this manuscript and hidden for decades, believing he was preserving it. In reality, he was denying the world its music. Her insight landed with precision, illuminating the fundamental error in both my approach and Lucas's. We had each in our own way tried to protect ourselves and others by burying important truths. The consequences of those burial decisions were now erupting through the polished surface of the gallery opening. A silver-haired man in an impeccable suit approached our group, addressing me with the casual confidence of a peer. Thomas Edwards, I thought you looked familiar. Leonard Webb Metropolitan Museum. We corresponded about that Ravel collection in 2018. He extended his hand. Fascinating development with this Debussy piece. Any plans for public performance? Dr. Webb's intervention temporarily redirected the conversation, providing a professional context that allowed Lucas to regain some composure. The gallery assistant, who had been hovering nearby, seized the opportunity, gently reminding Lucas that critics from Artforum had arrived and were waiting to speak with him about the featured installation. Lucas straightened his tie, visibly pulling himself back into his professional role. I need to handle this, but we're not finished here. His words carried a double meaning, both a practical acknowledgement of his immediate responsibilities and a promise that our personal reckoning would continue. As Lucas moved away to attend to his professional obligations, Elizabeth stepped closer, her expression fluctuating between hurt and confusion. Why, Dad? Why maintain this fiction for 3 years? The question deserved more than the abbreviated explanation I'd offered earlier. After Catherine died, I felt disconnected from everything. My identity as a professor, a musician, a husband, it all seemed to belong to a different lifetime. When I met Lucas and realized who Emma had been, I saw an opportunity to reinvent myself in a way that might help heal your new family. Elizabeth shook her head, unconvinced. That doesn't explain why you kept it from me. I'm your daughter, not some fragile stranger you needed to protect. Her words struck with precision. She was right, of course. Whatever justification I'd created for deceiving Lucas shouldn't have extended to my own child. The realization made me question all my decisions since Catherine's death. Had I been acting out of compassion, or had grief pushed me into a strange form of cowardice? Mrs. Chen, who had been observing our exchange with the quiet attentiveness of someone accustomed to witnessing family dynamics, interjected gently. When my husband escaped Paris, he left behind his true name, along with most of his possessions. For decades, he lived as Chen Li rather than Li Vikheim. Sometimes we become different people to survive difficult circumstances. Her comparison gave me pause. Had I been merely surviving these past years rather than living authentically? Had I used Lucas's grief as an excuse to hide from my own? Dr. Webb, who had been examining the manuscript with professional interest, looked up sharply. Did you say Chen Li from the Shanghai ghetto? My God, he's a legend in preservation circles. The manuscripts he managed to save. Mrs. Chen nodded, a flash of pride momentarily displacing her reserved demeanor. My husband never sought recognition, but yes, he preserved several significant works during extraordinary circumstances. A small crowd had gathered around us now, drawn by the unexpected intersection of musical history, Holocaust survival, and family drama unfolding in the middle of a contemporary art opening. The gallery assistant returned, clearly torn between professional protocol and human curiosity. Mr. Bennett has asked if you would join him in his office, Dr. Edwards. He's completed his obligations with the critics. The moment had come for a more private reckoning. Elizabeth touched my arm. Do you want me to come with you? I considered her offer, tempted by the support she offered despite her own hurt feelings. No, sweetheart. This needs to be between Lucas and me first. Then we'll talk. All of us together. Mrs. Chen pressed something into my hand, a small ivory business card with an elegant gold border. When you're ready to discuss the manuscript's future, call me. My husband would want to know it found its proper home. Dr. Webb extended a similar invitation. The Met would be honored to host the first public performance if you're considering that route, Professor. He handed me his card as well. We could create quite a meaningful event around the piece's history in connection to your family. Family. The word echoed strangely as I made my way toward Lucas's office at the rear of the gallery. 3 years of careful fiction had created a family structure built on deliberate omissions. Would truth strengthen those bonds or shatter them beyond repair? Lucas's office reflected the same aesthetic as his gallery. Minimalist, expensive, meticulously curated. A single Nakamura sculpture occupied the center of his glass desk. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Soho's cobblestone streets. He stood with his back to the door, staring out at the city lights, his reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass. I have a box of Emma's things I've never opened. His words emerged without preamble, without turning around. After the funeral, I packed away everything that reminded me of her musical life. Concert programs, sheet music recordings, awards. Couldn't bear to throw them out, couldn't stand to look at them. For 3 years, that box has sat in our bedroom closet like a black hole of grief I've been orbiting around. He turned slowly to face me, his professional mask completely abandoned now. Why did Emma apply to study with you specifically? What did she see in your teaching that made her seek you out? The question revealed what was truly tormenting him. Not my deception, but the possibility that he'd never fully understood his sister's aspirations and talents. That in his grief, he'd erased essential parts of who she was. Emma's application essay mentioned your performances of Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit. Her words were precise, analytical. She described your interpretation of Scarbo as revealing both the technical scaffolding and the emotional architecture. She wanted to understand how you achieved that balance. Lucas moved to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and removed a slim file folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a concert program from Carnegie Hall. The date, May 15th, 3 years ago, was exactly 1 week before Emma's accident. She'd circled a single name in the program. Mine. We attended this together, Lucas said, his voice barely audible. Her last concert. You were in the audience. Some former student was performing. Emma pointed you out, said she hoped to study with you someday. I didn't make the connection until now. He placed the program carefully back in the folder. I've spent 3 years avoiding everything about her musical life, convincing myself I was moving forward. But I wasn't moving forward, I was moving away. From her memory, from who she really was. The realization seemed to physically affect him. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking much younger and more vulnerable than the confident gallery owner who had mocked my gift earlier. There's something else I need to know. You mentioned your wife had contact with Emma. Catherine was helping review applications while she was ill. She was particularly moved by Emma's submission and reached out directly to encourage her. They exchanged several emails in the months before we lost them both. Lucas closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this new connection. Do you have those emails? Yes, I've kept everything. And recordings? Did Emma send recordings to Catherine? Several. Practice sessions, mostly working through difficult passages. Lucas opened his eyes, a new determination visible in his expression. I want to hear them, all of them. I want to read what she wrote to your wife. The request itself represented an enormous shift, from active avoidance of Emma's musical life to deliberate engagement with it. Lucas was choosing to face precisely what he'd been running from for 3 years. I have everything at my apartment. Whenever you're ready. He nodded slowly, then gestured toward the door. We should get back to the gallery. I have a professional obligation to see this opening through to the end. But tomorrow we'll begin to unpack the past properly. The agreement settled between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but a commitment to move forward with truth rather than protective fictions. When we returned to the main gallery space, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Word of my identity had clearly spread among the attendees. Several people approached with academic questions about Debussy, creating an unusual hybrid of art, opening and music symposium. Elizabeth was deep in conversation with Mrs. Chen, and Dr. Webb, their heads bent together over the manuscript that had triggered the evening's revelations. A young woman with a press badge approached Lucas cautiously. "Mr. Bennett, there's an interesting story developing here about this Debussy manuscript and your family connection to it. Would you be willing to comment?" Lucas hesitated, visibly weighing his professional instincts against his personal turmoil. Before he could respond, Mrs. Chen stepped forward. "This manuscript has survived exile, war, and decades of waiting to find its true purpose. That story deserves to be told properly, with respect for all it represents." The reporter turned to her eagerly. "And you are Diane Chen, widow of Chen Li, who preserved this manuscript, along with several other cultural treasures during and after World War II. My husband believed deeply in the responsibility of custodianship, that those who protect art must ensure it fulfills its purpose in the world." Lucas seemed to draw inspiration from Mrs. Chen's dignified presence. "The manuscript does have a remarkable story, one that unexpectedly intersects with my family's history. My sister Emma was a gifted pianist who died 3 years ago. She had applied to study with Professor Edwards just before her death. This manuscript, titled Daydream for Emma, creates a connection none of us could have anticipated. His ability to articulate this narrative, to publicly acknowledge Emma's musical identity and my professional one, marked a significant evolution from the man who had mocked my gift an hour earlier." The reporter was clearly captivated by the coincidences and connections. "This could make a wonderful feature for our arts section. Would the three of you be willing to sit for a proper interview?" Dr. Webb, who had been examining the manuscript with professional interest, joined our conversation. "The Metropolitan Museum would be interested in hosting a special event around this manuscript. Perhaps a performance of the piece accompanied by an exhibition on its journey from Debussy's desk to the present day." Lucas glanced at me, a question in his eyes. I nodded slightly, understanding his unspoken concern. "Yes, I could play it. Despite my retirement and the arthritis that had increasingly limited my performing capacity, I could bring this particular piece to life." "A performance would be appropriate," I agreed. "The piece itself is intimate, meant for a chamber setting rather than a concert hall." Debussy composed it during a transitional period in his career, just as he was beginning to develop his most distinctive harmonic language. As we discussed possibilities for the manuscript's public debut, I noticed Elizabeth watching us with a complex expression, part hurt, part hope. She had been excluded from my life as a professor and musician for 3 years, a collateral casualty of my well-intentioned deception. Repairing that relationship would require more than a single evening's revelations. The gallery opening concluded an hour later, the last patrons departing with considerably more to discuss than contemporary art. Lucas maintained his professional composure admirably, but I could see the strain in the tightness around his eyes, the occasional distant gaze as he processed all that had transpired. When the final guest departed, leaving only family and staff, Elizabeth approached me directly. "Dad, I need you to understand something." She spoke softly but with unmistakable intensity. "I've spent 3 years watching you and Lucas circle each other, cautiously, each of you guarding your separate territories. I thought it was just personality differences, but now I realize you were both actively maintaining a fiction that kept me from fully knowing either of you." Her assessment cut deep precisely because it was accurate. In trying to protect Lucas, I had created a barrier between myself and my daughter, a barrier she had sensed but couldn't identify until tonight. "You're right, Elizabeth. I convinced myself I was doing what was best for your new family, but I was wrong. By hiding who I was, I prevented us from building an authentic relationship with Lucas. And worse, I kept parts of myself from you." Mrs. Chen, who was preparing to leave, paused beside us. "When my husband changed his name and identity after the war, he believed he was protecting our family from painful history. But our children always sensed something was missing, some essential truth about their father that would help them understand themselves." Her gentle insight resonated powerfully. Had I, like Chen Li, believed that erasing part of my identity would somehow shield my family from pain? Had I underestimated Elizabeth's capacity to navigate complex truths? Lucas joined us, his professional mask finally dropped now that we were alone. "I need to apologize to you, Professor Edwards. My behavior tonight was inexcusable. I mocked your gift publicly, made assumptions about your knowledge, and spoke disparagingly in a language I wrongly believed you wouldn't understand. His apology, delivered with direct eye contact and evident sincerity, surprised me. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger at my deception. Instead, he was acknowledging his own role in tonight's confrontation. "We've both made mistakes, Lucas. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. My intentions were good, but my approach was wrong." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly at this exchange. Sometimes the past must be confronted before the future can properly begin. She gently placed the manuscript in my hands. "This belongs with you for now, Dr. Edwards. When you're ready to share Emma's music with the world, I hope you'll include my husband's story in its journey." As Mrs. Chen departed, Lucas, Elizabeth, and I stood in the empty gallery, the manuscript between us like a bridge connecting three separate islands of experience. The contemporary art on the walls seemed suddenly less significant than the human composition we were attempting to create, a family built on truth rather than protective fictions. Elizabeth broke the silence first. "I'd like to come to your apartment tomorrow too, Dad. I want to hear Emma's recordings, read those emails. I need to understand the connections you've both been hiding from me." Her request was entirely reasonable, more than reasonable. She deserved full inclusion in whatever reconciliation process Lucas and I were beginning. "Of course, sweetheart. There's something else you should know as well." I explained about the Catherine Edwards Memorial Scholarship I'd established at Manhattan School of Music after Catherine's death. The $25,000 annual grant supported a promising piano student who showed exceptional talent but faced financial barriers to education. What I hadn't told anyone was that Emma had been indirectly responsible for inspiring it. After discovering Catherine's correspondence with Emma, I'd been struck by my wife's final assessment. "This young woman has extraordinary potential, Thomas. She reminds me of those rare students who understand music as a language of the soul rather than merely a technical challenge." Creating the scholarship had been my way of honoring both Catherine's judgment and Emma's promise, ensuring that other young musicians with that same spark would have the opportunity Emma had lost. Lucas listened to this explanation with growing emotion. Each new revelation seemed to connect him more deeply to the sister he'd tried to separate from his current life. She would have been honored by that scholarship. His voice caught slightly. To know that her memory was helping other musicians. It wasn't just about memory, I clarified. The current scholarship recipient, Mei Jiang, has a remarkable talent for Debussy's preludes. Her interpretation of the Sunken Cathedral reminds me of Emma's approach to Claire de Lune, technically precise, but with an unusual emotional intelligence. In a very real way, Emma's musical legacy continues through students like May. Elizabeth looked between us, absorbing the implications. "So while you two were carefully avoiding any discussion of music or Emma's talent, you were actually connected through this scholarship all along." The irony left her momentarily speechless. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, disheveling his carefully maintained appearance. "I've been a coward, hiding from Emma's memory instead of honoring it. And in doing so, I've missed the opportunity to know my father-in-law, the real Professor Edwards, not the simplified version he presented." The gallery assistant interrupted apologetically. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett, but the cleaning crew needs to start their work. The installations need special attention before tomorrow's public hours." Lucas nodded, professional responsibilities momentarily reasserting themselves. "We should continue this conversation elsewhere. Professor Edwards, Thomas, would you join us for dinner? There's a small restaurant around the corner that stays open late." The invitation represented another significant shift. Lucas actively seeking to extend our conversation, rather than retreating to process his emotions privately. My first instinct was to accept, but a glance at Elizabeth made me reconsider. Her expression contained equal measures of exhaustion and emotional overwhelm. What she needed wasn't more revelations in a public setting, but time to process what she'd already learned. "Perhaps we should all take the evening to reflect," I suggested gently. "Tomorrow will bring enough emotional complexity when we review Emma's recordings and correspondence." Elizabeth's relief was visible. "You're right, Dad. I need some time to adjust to who you actually are." She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I feel like I'm meeting my father for the first time at age 34. Her comment hit me with unexpected force. Had my deception really created such distance between us? Had I been so focused on protecting Lucas from painful associations that I'd sacrificed my relationship with my own daughter, Lucas, placed a supportive arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. "Let's go home, honey. We all need rest before tomorrow." He turned to me. 9 o'clock at your apartment. We can spend the day going through Emma's materials." The plan established, we parted outside the gallery. I watched them walk away, Lucas's arms still around Elizabeth, their silhouettes merging with the Soho night crowd. Something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. The carefully constructed fiction I'd maintained for 3 years had collapsed in a single evening, leaving us to rebuild on a foundation of uncomfortable truths. I made my way home to my Upper West Side apartment, the manuscript secure in its protective sleeve inside my briefcase. The doorman greeted me with his usual friendly nod, unaware that the professor returning home was not quite the same man who had left earlier that evening. Something had awakened in me, a version of Thomas Edwards that had been dormant since Catherine's death, since my retirement, since I'd adopted the simplified identity of Tom the piano tuner. My apartment reflected this dormant identity. Walls lined with the bookshelves holding rare musical texts and first editions, a Steinway grand piano, occupying the living room's prime space, framed photographs documenting my academic career. I'd maintained this shrine to my former life while pretending to be someone else entirely in Lucas and Elizabeth's presence. The contradiction suddenly seemed absurd, even pathological. I placed the Debussy manuscript carefully on the piano's music stand, then sat on the bench, flexing my arthritic fingers experimentally. The piece wasn't technically demanding by virtuoso standards. Debussy had composed it as an intimate character piece rather than a concert showpiece. But it carried emotional complexities that transcended its apparent simplicity. My fingers found the opening notes hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The melody unfolded in Debussy's characteristic modal harmonies, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that suited its title. As I played, I found myself thinking of Emma, a talented young woman I'd never met, but whose life had become strangely intertwined with mine. I thought of Lucas, who had walled himself off from his sister's musical world out of self-preservation. I thought of Elizabeth, caught between husband and father, each withholding essential truths. And I thought of Catherine, who would have handled this situation with far more grace and wisdom than I had managed. She would have found a way to honor Emma's memory without deception, to support Lucas's healing without enabling his avoidance. She would have ensured Elizabeth remained fully included in the truth of our family history. The manuscript's final measures resolved in a gentle plagal cadence, leaving a lingering question in the air, rather than definitive closure. How appropriate, I reflected, for our current situation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges as Lucas confronted the sister he had been avoiding, and I reclaimed the identity I'd set aside. The resolution of our family discord remained as unwritten as the public performance of Daydream for Emma. I closed the piano lid gently and began preparing for tomorrow's difficult conversations. From my study, I retrieved the folder containing Emma's application materials, Catherine's correspondence, and the recordings they had exchanged. I arranged these on the coffee table alongside photo albums documenting my academic career, evidence of the life I'd hidden from Lucas and, by extension, from my own daughter. As I made these preparations, my phone signaled an incoming email. The sender was Dr. Leonard Webb from the Metropolitan Museum, following up on our conversation at the gallery. Professor Edwards' tonight's serendipitous discovery presents a unique opportunity for a meaningful exhibition. The manuscript's journey from Debussy to Chen Li to your family, coupled with its connection to your late student Emma Bennett, creates a compelling narrative about music's power to transcend time and tragedy. Please consider the Met as a partner in bringing this story to the public through performance and exhibition. The email continued with potential dates and programming ideas, but what caught my attention was his reference to Emma as my late student. The description wasn't technically accurate. Emma had never formally studied with me, but it contained an emotional truth that resonated deeply. In some parallel reality, one without rainy nights and tragic accidents, she would have been my student. Catherine had recognized her potential, had begun the mentoring relationship that I would have continued. I replied briefly to Webb, thanking him for his interest and promising a more detailed response after discussing options with the family. Family. The word carried new weight now. For 3 years, I'd been an artificial version of myself within the family structure, maintaining a careful distance that I justified as respect for Lucas's grief. Tomorrow would begin the difficult process of authentic integration. Lucas confronting Emma's musical identity, Elizabeth discovering her father's professional legacy, and me stepping fully into my role as both father and father-in-law. The prospect was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. I moved to the window gazing out at the city lights. Somewhere across town, Lucas and Elizabeth were having their own difficult conversation, processing revelations that had fundamentally altered their understanding of family history. The manuscript that had triggered tonight's confrontation now rested on my piano, its journey not yet complete. Daydream for Emma, composed for one Emma in 1894, preserved through war and exile by Chen Li, discovered in an estate sale after Catherine's death, and now connecting to another Emma through an unexpected series of coincidences. Music in exile, Mrs. Chen had called it, finally finding its way home. Home. Not just a physical location, but a state of authentic being. For 3 years, I'd been in a self-imposed exile from my true identity. Tomorrow would begin the journey home. To myself, to honest relationships with Elizabeth and Lucas, to a family built on truth rather than well-intentioned fictions. I returned to the piano, opened the lid, and began to play the manuscript again, my fingers finding greater confidence in the second attempt. The music filled my apartment, Debussy's distinctive harmonies, creating a sound world that was neither major nor minor, neither fully resolved nor completely unresolved, but something in between. Like our family situation, poised between past deceptions and future truths, between grief and healing, between separation and connection. The final notes lingered in the air, a musical question mark rather than a definitive period. Tomorrow would begin to provide answers, painful as they might be. Tomorrow, Emma's voice would be heard again through recordings and writings. Tomorrow, Lucas would confront the sister he'd tried to forget, and Elizabeth would meet the father she'd never fully known. I closed the piano lid gently and prepared for bed, aware that tonight marked the end of Tom the piano tuner and the return of Professor Thomas Edwards, with all the complexities, responsibilities, and truths that identity entailed. 6 months after that night at the gallery, I sat in Lucas and Elizabeth's living room, watching my son-in-law's fingers move carefully across the piano keys. He was playing the opening measures of Daydream for Emma, his technique still uncertain, but his intention clear. Remember, the middle section should feel like a conversation, not a performance. Let the melody breathe. Lucas nodded, adjusting his touch. The music that emerged was simple but heartfelt. Not the transcendent interpretation Emma might have given it, but something equally valuable. A brother's love made audible. Better, I said. Emma would be proud. Lucas smiled, continuing to play. We'd been having weekly lessons since that night at the gallery, and slowly, carefully, he was rebuilding his relationship with music. Not as the overwhelming force that had defined and ultimately claimed Emma, but as a language of connection and memory. The Steinway baby grand piano occupying the center of their Soho loft had been Lucas's idea, a 40th birthday gift to Elizabeth that doubled as a commitment to his own healing process. The purchase had surprised everyone, including Lucas himself. After 3 years of avoiding anything related to classical music, he'd walked into a piano showroom one Tuesday afternoon and returned home having commissioned an instrument that would take 6 months to deliver. The manuscript itself was now professionally framed and mounted on the wall above the piano, not as a museum piece or investment, but as a living part of their home. Lucas had insisted on displaying the authentication documents alongside it, not to prove its financial value, but to honor the journey that had brought it to him. That journey had taken unexpected turns in the months since our confrontation at Meridian Contemporary. What began as a night of revelations had evolved into a process of integration, painful at times, but ultimately healing for our restructured family. The morning after the gallery opening, Lucas and Elizabeth had arrived at my apartment precisely at 9, both wearing expressions of determined composure. I'd spent hours preparing for their visit, arranging Emma's application materials, Catherine's correspondence, and the recordings they had exchanged. I'd also selected photographs from my academic career textbooks I'd authored and reviews of my performances, the evidence of a life I'd hidden from them for 3 years. Lucas had approached these materials with the focused intensity of someone diving into ice water, bracing himself for pain but committed to the immersion. Elizabeth had moved more cautiously, examining each item with a daughter's retrospective gaze, seeing her father through new eyes. The recordings had affected Lucas most profoundly. Hearing Emma's voice between practice segments, Her frustrated sighs, occasional laughter, analytical comments about particularly challenging passages had temporarily overwhelmed him. Elizabeth had supported him through these moments, her initial hurt about my deception set aside in service to her husband's more immediate pain. We've been making progress in small, deliberate steps since that day. Lucas found a grief counselor specializing in delayed mourning, someone who understood his need to finally process the sister he'd tried to forget. Elizabeth and I established a new routine of weekly lunches where I gradually reintroduced her to my actual life history, filling in the gaps created by 3 years of strategic omissions. And I rediscovered myself, not just as Professor Thomas Edwards, but as someone navigating the complex territory between professional legacy and personal relationships. The manuscript that had triggered our confrontation became a focus for this integration process, with unexpected developments expanding its significance beyond our family circle. Mrs. Chen had been the catalyst for the most surprising of these developments. 2 weeks after the gallery opening, she'd invited the three of us to tea at her Upper East Side apartment. The elegant pre-war building with its uniformed doormen and marble lobby hinted at financial resources beyond what I'd assumed from our previous interactions. Her apartment had revealed a carefully curated collection of artistic and historical treasures, paintings, manuscripts, and artifacts that told the story of her husband's remarkable life. Chen Li, born Levichheim in Warsaw in 1925, had survived the Shanghai ghetto during World War II while preserving cultural artifacts entrusted to his family before their flight from Europe. What I didn't realize until that afternoon was that Daydream for Emma was part of a larger collection, a set of previously unknown Debussy manuscripts that had been separated during the chaos of war. Mrs. Chen believed that others might still exist, possibly in private collections or institutional archives, without their owners recognizing their significance or connection to our manuscript. The possibility that Daydream for Emma might have musical siblings somewhere in the world had captured Lucas's imagination. The gallery owner, who had once defined himself in opposition to Emma's musical world, now found himself drawn to a quest that honored it. He'd begun researching wartime displacement of cultural artifacts, connecting with art recovery specialists, and developing professional relationships with music historians. His gallery had evolved as well, incorporating exhibitions that explored the intersection of visual art and music. His first such show, Harmonic Visions When Artists Hear Color, had received critical acclaim and attracted a new clientele interested in cross-disciplinary approaches to contemporary art. Elizabeth had undergone her own evolution, reconnecting with the childhood piano lessons she'd abandoned in her teens. She didn't have Emma's prodigious talent or Lucas's newfound dedication, but she enjoyed casual playing as a way to bridge the worlds of her husband and father. Her professional life as an environmental attorney remained separate from our musical explorations, but she no longer felt excluded from essential family connections. As for me, I'd emerged from retirement to consult on several projects related to the manuscript. Dr. Webb had organized a special exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum exploring the journey of Daydream for Emma, from Debussy's desk to our family's hands. The exhibition included artifacts from Chen Li's Shanghai years, materials related to Emma's musical education, and interactive elements allowing visitors to explore Debussy's compositional techniques. The exhibition had attracted unexpected attention from musical scholars interested in Debussy's transitional period. Several had contacted me requesting access to the manuscript for academic study. Their interest had led to a surprising discovery. Certain harmonic progressions in Daydream for Emma prefigured techniques Debussy would develop more fully in his later compositions. The manuscript wasn't just a curiosity or valuable collector's item, it represented a missing link in understanding the composer's artistic evolution. This scholarly attention had culminated in an invitation to present a paper at an international conference on Impressionist composers scheduled for next spring in New York. The prospect of returning to academic discourse after 5 years of retirement both excited and intimidated me. My fingers were stiffer, now my performance capabilities limited by advancing arthritis. But my analytical mind remained sharp, and the manuscript had given me a unique contribution to offer the musicological community. Lucas finished playing the first section of Daydream for Emma and paused, flexing his fingers. I never understood why she practiced so obsessively, 6-7 hours a day sometimes. But now, feeling how the smallest adjustment changes everything, the pressure, the timing, the weight transfer between fingers, I get it. There's an infinite world inside each phrase. His insight reflected how far he'd come in these 6 months, from avoiding all mention of Emma's musical life to actively engaging with its complexities. The weekly lessons had become more than piano instruction. They were a form of guided remembrance, allowing Lucas to reconnect with his sister through the art form that had defined her. Elizabeth entered from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee cups. Lucas's playing has improved dramatically since you started teaching him, Dad. Though I'm not sure our neighbors appreciate the 7 a.m. practice sessions quite as much as I do. Lucas accepted the coffee she offered, his expression turning more serious. The building manager mentioned complaints again yesterday. Apparently, Debussy, before breakfast, isn't universally appreciated. The practical challenges of urban piano study had been an ongoing issue since the Steinways' arrival 3 months ago. Their loft, while spacious by Manhattan standards, shared walls with neighboring units. The building's pre-war construction offered limited sound insulation, creating friction with residents accustomed to professional neighbors who respected conventional working hours. You could use the practice rooms at Juilliard, I suggested. I still have faculty privileges despite my retirement. Lucas shook his head firmly. I need to practice here where the manuscript is, where I feel connected to Emma. His determination reflected another aspect of his healing process, the need to integrate music into his daily home environment rather than compartmentalizing it as a separate activity. Elizabeth sipped her coffee thoughtfully. We could look into soundproofing options, convert the guest room into a proper music studio. The suggestion illustrated how completely our family dynamic had shifted. 6 months ago, Lucas had avoided all connection to classical music. Now Elizabeth was proposing structural home renovations to accommodate his growing engagement with it. Before we could pursue this conversation further, Lucas's phone signaled an incoming message. His expression changed as he read it, excitement replacing his previous concern. It's from Isabelle Moreau at the Bibliothèque Nationale. They've found something in their archives that might be related to our manuscript. Isabelle Moreau, the chief musicologist at France's National Library, had been corresponding with Lucas since learning about Daydream for Emma through Dr. Webb's exhibition. Her interest had initially focused on authenticating our manuscript against known Debussy exemplars. This new development suggested her research had uncovered something unexpected. Lucas quickly scanned the email's contents. There's a collection of letters between Debussy and Emma Bardak from 1894 that mentions a suite of daydreams he was composing for her. Not just our piece, but potentially multiple movements. And there's a catalog reference to acquisition of musical manuscripts from a private collector in 1955 that might include some of the missing pieces. The possibility of discovering additional sections of what might be a larger composition energized all of us. If Daydream for Emma was actually part of a suite, its musical significance would increase substantially. More importantly for Lucas, it would expand his connection to the sister he had spent 3 years trying to forget. We should contact Mrs. Chen immediately, I suggested. Her husband's knowledge of displaced musical manuscripts might help us understand the potential connections. Elizabeth was already reaching for her phone. I'll call her now. She's been hoping for exactly this kind of development. The prospect of a treasure hunt for lost Debussy manuscripts had captured our collective imagination, providing a shared project that honored both Emma's memory and Chen Li's legacy. What had begun as a confrontation at a gallery opening had evolved into a family mission that drew on each of our strengths. Lucas's art world connections, Elizabeth's organizational skills, my musical expertise, and Mrs. Chen's historical knowledge. As Elizabeth spoke with Mrs. Chen, Lucas returned to the piano, playing the manuscript's opening phrase with new intensity. I can feel it, he said quietly. This piece wants to continue beyond its final measure. It's asking a question that needs another movement to answer. His musical intuition surprised me. Despite only 6 months of lessons, he was developing a sensitivity to compositional structure that many formally trained pianists never achieve. Perhaps this was the benefit of approaching music as an adult with life experience, informing his understanding of emotional narrative. Elizabeth concluded her call with evident excitement. Mrs. Chen is coming over this afternoon. She says her husband left journals that might contain information about other manuscripts from the same collection. She hadn't thought to check them until now. The afternoon's impromptu gathering expanded to include Dr. Webb from the Metropolitan Museum and Mei Zhang, the current recipient of the Catherine Edwards Memorial Scholarship. I'd invited May partly because her thesis research focused on Debussy's unpublished works, but also because I wanted Lucas to meet a young musician who embodied the same dedication that had defined Emma's approach to piano. Mrs. Chen arrived first carrying a worn leather journal with Chinese characters embossed on its cover. Chen Li's private record of the artifacts he had encountered during his extraordinary life. She'd never translated it completely. She explained both because of the specialized vocabulary he used and because some memories were too painful to revisit. The relevant entries, which she had marked with silk ribbons, detailed his acquisition of the Debussy manuscript in Paris in 1964. The seller, a former resistance member named Marcel Fournier, had obtained it and other papers from a German officer's abandoned quarters in the chaotic days following liberation. Fournier believed the manuscripts had been confiscated from Jewish collections, but had no documentation of their specific provenance. According to Chen Li's notes, Fournier had mentioned other Debussy pieces with similar titles: Daydream for Morning, Daydream for Evening, and Daydream for Midnight, that had been separated from our manuscript during the war. He had sold them to different collectors, keeping minimal records due to lingering concerns about ownership disputes. Webb listened to this information with growing excitement. This aligns perfectly with what Isabelle Moreau found in the Bibliothèque Nationale archives. Debussy's letters to Emma Bardak mention a suite of 4 daydreams representing different times of day, each with its own distinct mood and harmonic approach. The possibility that our manuscript was 1/4 of a larger composition elevated its musical and historical significance considerably. If the other movements could be located and authenticated, the complete suite would represent a major addition to Debussy's known works. Mei Zhang, who had been examining our manuscript with the focused attention of a specialist, offered her perspective. The harmonic structure suggests it's designed to be part of a cycle. There are unresolved elements that would make more sense in the context of multiple movements. Her assessment confirmed Lucas's intuitive feeling about the music wanting to continue. Despite his limited technical understanding, he had sensed something that May's trained analysis now verified. The connection visibly pleased him, another thread linking him to the musical world his sister had inhabited. As our impromptu research team discussed next steps for tracking the missing manuscripts, I observed Lucas watching May with particular intensity. When she demonstrated certain passages on the piano, her technique reminded me of recordings I'd heard of Emma. The same precision combined with emotional intelligence, the same physically efficient approach to challenging sections. During a break in the discussion, Lucas approached May directly. "My sister would have been about your age now. She was studying at Manhattan School of Music when she died. Did you ever hear of Emma Bennett?" The question, direct, unguarded, openly acknowledging Emma's musical identity, demonstrated how far Lucas had come in his healing process. 6 months ago, he couldn't bear to discuss his sister's musical life. Now he was actively seeking connections to her world. May's response surprised all of us. Professor Steinberg mentions her sometimes when he's pushing us to practice more consistently. Emma Bennett would have been in the practice rooms until midnight and back at 6 the next morning. She's become almost legendary among the piano students, the brilliant performer we lost too soon. The revelation that Emma had achieved a kind of immortality in the institutional memory of her school visibly moved Lucas. She always said she wanted to leave a mark on the music world. I guess she did, just not in the way she planned. His comment, delivered with some but genuine acceptance, reflected a new integration of grief and appreciation. Lucas was no longer running from Emma's memory, but finding ways to honor it, to reconnect with the sister he'd walled off from his consciousness for 3 years. Dr. Webb, who had been examining Chen Li's journal with Mrs. Chen's permission, looked up with renewed excitement. There's a reference here to a Swiss banker named Heinrich Bergmann who purchased one of the companion pieces, likely Daydream for Morning based on the description. His collection was donated to the Zurich Conservatory after his death in 1989. This potential lead energized our group. If one of the missing manuscripts could be located in an institutional collection, it might provide clues to the whereabouts of the others. More importantly, it would confirm that Daydream for Emma was indeed part of a larger compositional cycle. Mrs. Chen offered additional perspective. "My husband believes strongly in the concept of musical repatriation, returning compositions to the cultural conversation after periods of suppression or loss. Finding these companion pieces would fulfill his vision of cultural restoration." As our meeting continued into early evening, plans emerged for a coordinated research effort. Dr. Webb would contact the Zurich Conservatory regarding the Bergman collection. Isabelle Moreau would search French archives for any record of the other manuscripts. Lucas would leverage his art world connections to inquire about private collections that might include unrecognized Debussy works. The collaborative energy filling the apartment represented everything I had hoped might eventually emerge from that difficult night at the gallery. We had moved from confrontation to cooperation, from protective fictions to shared purpose. Lucas was no longer defining himself in opposition to Emma's musical world, but finding ways to honor it that aligned with his own strengths and connections. As our guest prepared to leave, May approached the piano one last time. Would it be appropriate for me to play the manuscript? I've been studying Debussy's Preludes for my thesis, and I'd love to experience this piece firsthand. Lucas nodded immediately. Please do. I'd like to hear it performed properly. His willingness to hear the manuscript played by a skilled performer, to allow the music to fully exist as sound rather than merely as a historical artifact, marked another milestone in his healing process. May seated herself at the piano, took a moment to study the framed manuscript, then began to play. Her interpretation brought dimensions to the piece that Lucas's student efforts couldn't yet achieve. Subtle voicing of inner harmonies, precise control of dynamic contrasts, intuitive understanding of Debussy's distinctive rhythmic flexibility. The music filled the apartment, transforming our theoretical discussions into lived aesthetic experience. I watched Lucas during the performance, noting the complex emotions playing across his features: recognition, appreciation, sadness, and something approaching peace. When May finished, he thanked her with genuine warmth. That's how Emma would have played it, finding the questions hidden inside each phrase. After our guest departed, Lucas, Elizabeth, and I remained in the living room processing the afternoon's discoveries and their implications for our ongoing project. The possibility that Daydream for Emma might be reunited with its companion pieces created a sense of purpose that transcended our family healing. We were now engaged in a cultural restoration effort that honored both Emma's memory and Chenli's legacy. Lucas broke the companionable silence with an unexpected announcement. Sarah and I have some news. Elizabeth smiled, reaching for his hand. We're pregnant. The simple statement landed with seismic impact. After 3 years of marriage, they had postponed having children, partly due to career demands, but also, I suspected, because Lucas hadn't fully processed his grief over Emma. His decision to embrace fatherhood suggested a new orientation toward the future rather than the past. That's wonderful news. Congratulations to you both. Elizabeth's smile widened. We've been talking about names. If it's a girl, we'd like to call her Emma. The decision to name their child after Lucas's sister represented the complete inversion of his previous approach to grief. Instead of walling off Emma's memory, he was now planning to incorporate it into the next generation, to speak her name daily, to share her story with the newest Emma, who would grow up knowing her aunt's legacy. And if it's a boy, Lucas added, we were thinking Thomas after the grandfather who taught us that love sometimes requires patience. The emotional impact of their decision momentarily overwhelmed my ability to respond. After years of maintaining a careful fiction to avoid triggering Lucas's grief, I was being honored for finally telling the truth. The pretense I had created out of compassion had ultimately proven less healing than the authenticity I had feared would cause pain. I would be honored regardless of whether you have a son or daughter. Lucas returned to the piano, playing the opening phrase of Daydream for Emma with growing confidence. I've been thinking about that concert Emma gave at Carnegie Hall, the one where you were in the audience. I avoided watching the recording for 3 years. Last week, I finally found the courage to view it. His willingness to engage directly with video documentation of his sister represented another significant step in his healing journey. Moving from audio recordings to visual evidence required confronting the full reality of her physical presence and the talent that had been lost. She was extraordinary, wasn't she? His question carried no expectation of false reassurance. He wanted honest assessment from a professional whose judgment he had come to trust. Yes, she was. Not just technically accomplished, but emotionally intelligent in her interpretive choices. She understood that music isn't just about playing notes correctly. It's about asking questions through sound. Lucas nodded, absorbing this evaluation of his sister's gifts. There's something I'd like to propose. A memorial concert on the anniversary of her death next month. Not just performances of existing works, but the premiere of Daydream for Emma in its first public presentation. The suggestion demonstrated how completely Lucas had transformed his relationship to Emma's memory and musical identity. From avoiding all reminders of her artistic life, he was now actively planning a public celebration of it. That would be appropriate, I agreed. Who would you want to perform it? Lucas glanced toward the piano. I was hoping you would, Professor. Despite your arthritis, despite your retirement, no one else has the same connection to the manuscript or to Emma's legacy. His request honored my musical identity in the same way that his child-naming decision had honored my personal one. After years of pretending to be merely a piano tuner in his presence, I was being asked to publicly reclaim my identity as a performer and scholar. I flexed my arthritic fingers experimentally, considering the physical challenges. The manuscript isn't technically demanding by virtuoso standards. I could manage it with proper preparation, perhaps with Mei Jiang performing the other movements if we locate them in time. Elizabeth joined the conversation with practical considerations. We could hold it at Merkin Concert Hall, intimate enough for chamber music, but prestigious enough to attract attention for the scholarly aspects. The New York Times might cover it, given the manuscript's unusual history and connection to Chen Li's wartime experiences. The planning quickly expanded beyond a simple memorial performance. Lucas envisioned complementary elements drawing on his professional expertise, perhaps an exhibition of visual art inspired by Debussy's music, or archival photographs documenting the manuscript's journey through wartime Europe to our hands. I would want Mrs. Chen centrally involved, I noted. Her husband's role in preserving the manuscript deserves recognition, and her ongoing support has been invaluable to our research efforts. Lucas agreed immediately. We should create a proper tribute to Chen Li as part of the event, perhaps a documentary short film about his cultural preservation work during and after the war. Our conversation continued into the evening, the memorial concert plans evolving into a multidisciplinary event that would honor Emma Catherine and Chen Li while celebrating the manuscript that had connected all of us in unexpected ways. What had begun as a confrontation at a gallery opening had transformed into a collaborative project drawing on each of our strengths and histories. When I finally prepared to leave, Lucas walked me to the door with uncharacteristic hesitation in his manner. Before you go, Professor, there's something else I'd like to discuss. He glanced back toward Elizabeth, who nodded encouragement. I've been thinking about the Emma Bennett Memorial Scholarship you established. I'd like to contribute to it, to increase the annual award to $50,000 and expand its scope to include visual artists as well as musicians. His proposal represented the complete integration of his separate worlds, the contemporary art gallery owner and the grieving brother of a classical pianist finding common purpose in supporting young artists. The scholarship that I had established privately as a way to honor Emma would evolve into a joint family project acknowledging her influence across artistic disciplines. That would be wonderful, Lucas. Emma never believed in rigid boundaries between art forms. She once told Catherine that she visualized colors and shapes while playing Debussy. Lucas smiled at this previously unknown detail about his sister. That sounds exactly like her. Even as a child, she described sounds in terms of colors and textures. I never fully understood it until I began connecting with her musical world these past months. As I departed their apartment building, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey our family had undertaken since that confrontation at Meridian Contemporary. The manuscript titled Daydream for Emma had catalyzed a process of truth-telling and reconciliation that none of us could have anticipated. Lucas had moved from avoiding all connection to his sister's musical identity to actively engaging with it, even learning to play the instrument that had defined her brief life. Elizabeth had rediscovered aspects of her relationship with me that had been submerged beneath years of protective fiction. I had emerged from retirement and reclaimed my academic identity while developing a more authentic connection with my daughter and son-in-law. The manuscript itself had transcended its status as a valuable collector's item to become the focal point for ongoing research, potentially leading to discovery of its companion pieces and expansion of Debussy's known compositional output. What had begun as a private family drama had evolved into a project with genuine cultural significance. As I walked through the evening streets toward the subway station, I found myself anticipating next month's memorial concert with a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since Catherine's death. My fingers would need careful conditioning to perform publicly again, but the effort seemed newly worthwhile. Some music deserves to be heard regardless of the technical challenges involved in its performance. The pregnancy announcement had affected me more deeply than I'd been able to express in the moment. The prospect of becoming a grandfather, of meeting a grandchild who might be named either Emma or Thomas, created a future orientation that had been lacking in my life since retirement. The child who would arrive in approximately 7 months would never know the artificial version of me that I'd presented for 3 years. They would know only the authentic Professor Thomas Edwards, with all the complexity and history that identity entailed. Sometimes the most valuable gifts aren't the ones we give, but the ones we receive in return. Lucas had given me something I hadn't even known I was missing. A son who understood that love sometimes works in mysterious ways and that the most powerful healing often comes through honoring what we've lost rather than running from it.